The shuttle screamed through the thick atmosphere of Kepler 442b like a falling star. Lieutenant Jake Morrison gripped the controls with white knuckles as warning lights flashed red across his dashboard. The main engine was dead. Life support systems beeped urgent warnings. His radio crackled with static instead of the reassuring voices of his squadron. "Come on, come on," Jake muttered through gritted teeth. He pulled back on the stick, trying to level the shuttle's nose. The dense jungle below rushed up to meet him at a deadly speed. Trees that looked like green towers stretched toward the sky. This was not going to be a gentle landing. The shuttle clipped the top of a massive tree. Jake felt the impact shake through his bones. Metal screamed against wood. Branches crashed through the side windows, spraying leaves and debris into the cockpit. The shuttle spun once, twice, then slammed into the forest floor with a bone-jarring crash. Silence. Jake opened his eyes slowly. His head pounded. Blood trickled down his forehead from a cut above his eyebrow. The smell of burning electronics filled his nose. Smoke drifted up from the console in front of him. He was alive, but that might not last long. He unbuckled his safety harness with shaking hands. Every movement sent pain shooting through his ribs. Probably cracked, he thought. Jake stumbled to the back of the shuttle to check his supplies. The good news was that his emergency kit was intact. The bad news was everything else. The main engine had a hole the size of his fist burned right through the core housing. Coolant leaked in green puddles across the floor. The navigation system displayed only error messages. His communication array was a twisted mess of metal and sparking wires. The distress beacon, his only hope of rescue, sat dark and silent. Jake pulled up his environmental readings on a handheld scanner. The air outside was breathable, thank goodness. Oxygen levels were actually higher than Earth normal. Temperature was warm but not dangerous. The scanner also picked up something else that made his blood run cold. Large life forms, moving, getting closer. He knew about Kepler 442b from the briefing files. This planet was home to the Vraxani, a species that the Galactic Coalition had marked as approach with extreme caution. The reports described them as apex predators, 12 feet tall, built like nightmares, intelligent but territorial and aggressive toward outsiders. No successful first contact had ever been made. Jake gathered his tools and stepped outside the wrecked shuttle. The jungle was unlike anything he had ever seen. Trees rose like natural skyscrapers, their trunks wider than houses. Vines thick as cables hung between them. Strange flowers in impossible colors dotted the undergrowth. The air hummed with insect life and distant animal calls. He circled his shuttle, assessing the damage. It was worse than he had hoped, but maybe not completely hopeless. If he could patch the engine housing and get the coolant system working, he might have a chance. The problem was time. His suit's readings showed he had maybe 48 hours of life support remaining. After that, he would be breathing whatever was in the jungle air and hoping it would not kill him. Jake set up a basic perimeter around the shuttle, using motion sensors from his emergency kit. If something big came calling, he wanted to know about it. Then he got to work. He pulled panels off the engine housing and stared at the damage. The hole went deep, all the way through to the reaction chamber. This was not something he could fix with basic tools and spare parts. As the hours passed, Jake became aware that he was being watched. At first, it was just a feeling, the sense that eyes were on him. Then he began to catch glimpses of movement in the thick undergrowth. Shadows that did not match the swaying plants. Golden flashes that might have been eyes reflecting the alien sun. His motion sensors remained silent. Whatever was watching him was either too small to trigger them or smart enough to avoid them. Jake kept working, but his hand stayed close to the plasma rifle on his belt. The weapon would not do much against a full-grown Vraxani, but it might give him a few seconds to run. The watchers revealed themselves as the sun began to set. 3 creatures emerged from the jungle with careful, deliberate steps. Jake's breath caught in his throat. They were definitely Vraxani, but not the massive predators from the reports. These were small, young, cubs. Each cub stood about 4 feet tall on powerful hind legs. Their bodies were covered in sleek fur that shifted color from gold to brown to green as they moved. Their heads were elongated, almost reptilian, with intelligent golden eyes that seemed to see everything. Sharp claws extended from their hands, but they held them carefully away from their bodies in what Jake hoped was a peaceful gesture. The cubs approached slowly, stopping about 20 feet from the shuttle. They tilted their heads in unison, studying Jake with obvious curiosity. One of them made a soft chirping sound. Another answered with a different tone. They were talking to each other. Jake froze, not wanting to make any sudden movements. His hand was still near his weapon, but something told him these young creatures were not a threat. They were curious, not hostile. The way they moved, the way they watched him, reminded him of children who had found something interesting in their backyard. The largest of the 3 cubs took a step closer, its golden eyes fixed on the damaged engine Jake had been working on. It made another chirping sound, this one directed at Jake. When he did not respond, the cub pointed at the engine with one clawed finger, then at Jake, then back at the engine. "You want to know what I'm doing?" Jake asked softly. His voice sounded strange in the alien jungle. The cubs' ears perked up at the sound. They exchanged more chirps among themselves. Jake slowly knelt down and picked up a broken piece of metal from the engine housing. He held it up so the cubs could see it, then pointed at the hole in the engine. "Broken," he said. He made a gesture like an explosion, not working. The cubs moved closer, their curiosity overcoming their caution. They formed a small semicircle around Jake and the shuttle, their golden eyes taking in every detail. One of them approached the engine housing and leaned in close, sniffing delicately at the damaged metal. As darkness fell over the alien jungle, Jake found himself surrounded by 3 young predators who seemed more interested in helping than hunting. He had no idea what would happen next, but for the first time since the crash, he felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he was not alone in this fight for survival. Jake woke up as the alien sun painted the jungle in shades of orange and gold. He had spent the night inside his shuttle, door sealed, listening to the strange sounds of the Vraxani world. Howls, clicks, and calls that spoke of a living ecosystem unlike anything on Earth. But through it all, he had heard the soft chirping of the 3 cubs who had set up camp just outside his shuttle. When he emerged with his morning ration pack, the cubs were waiting for him. They sat in a neat row, watching him with those intense golden eyes. The largest one, which Jake had started thinking of as the leader, chirped a greeting. Jake found himself chirping back, feeling slightly foolish but oddly pleased when the cubs seemed to approve. "Good morning to you too," Jake said. He opened his ration pack and took a bite of the tasteless protein bar inside. The cubs watched with fascination as he ate. When he finished, Jake picked up his tools and approached the damaged engine again. His repair attempts the day before had been disasters. Every time he tried to force a piece of metal to fit over the hole, it would snap or bend in the wrong direction. The plasma welder kept overheating. The patch seals would not hold pressure. Jake was a decent pilot, but engineering was not his strongest skill. He knelt beside the engine and pulled out a sheet of replacement metal. The hole in the housing was irregular, with jagged edges that made fitting a patch nearly impossible. Jake measured the opening and began cutting the metal to size with his plasma torch. The smell of burning metal filled the air. The cubs moved closer, drawn by his work. They chittered among themselves in their musical language, occasionally pointing at what Jake was doing. He ignored them, focused on getting the patch to fit properly. This time would be different. This time he would make it work. 20 minutes later, Jake sat back in frustration. The patch was close to the right size, but the edges would not align properly. No matter how he positioned it, There were gaps that would leak coolant or atmosphere. He wiped sweat from his forehead and reached for the plasma torch again. That was when the smallest cub, barely 3 feet tall, stepped forward. It made a soft sound, almost like a question. When Jake looked at it, the cub pointed at his bleeding hand. In his frustration, Jake had gripped a sharp piece of metal too tightly and opened a cut across his palm. "It's nothing," Jake said, wrapping the cut with a piece of cloth from his emergency kit. "Just a scratch." The small cub was not satisfied with this answer. It approached cautiously, making soothing sounds. When Jake did not move away, the cub gently took his injured hand in its clawed ones and examined the cut. Its touch was surprisingly gentle. After a moment, it released Jake's hand and turned to the damaged engine. What happened next made Jake's mouth fall open in amazement. The small cub placed its claws against the edge of the hole in the engine housing. But instead of trying to cut or force the metal, it simply touched it. Its claws traced the irregular edges with delicate precision. The cub closed its eyes and seemed to be listening to something Jake could not hear. The other 2 cubs joined their smaller companion. Together, they placed their hands on different parts of the damaged engine. They were not grabbing or manipulating anything. They were feeling, listening, learning. The largest cub picked up the metal patch Jake had cut. Instead of trying to force it into place, the cub held it near the hole and moved it slowly around the edges. It was not looking at the metal. Its eyes were closed, focused on some sense Jake did not understand. With movements that seemed almost like a dance, the largest cub began reshaping the patch. Its claws worked like precision tools, bending and adjusting the metal with tiny, careful adjustments. The other cubs watched and occasionally made soft sounds that seemed like suggestions or encouragement. Jake watched in fascination as the cubs worked. They were not using brute force or trying to make the metal do something it did not want to do. Instead, they seemed to be working with the metal, finding its natural inclinations, and using them. The patch began to change shape, flowing into curves and angles that matched the damaged engine perfectly. "How are you doing that?" Jake whispered. The smallest cub opened its eyes and looked at Jake. It made a series of chirps and clicks, then took Jake's hand and placed it on the engine housing. The metal felt cold and lifeless under his palm. The cub chirped again and pressed Jake's hand more firmly against the surface. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Jake felt it, a tiny vibration, so small he almost missed it. The metal was humming, not audibly, but he could feel it through his skin. The vibration changed slightly when he moved his hand to different parts of the engine. The cub made an encouraging sound and moved Jake's hand to the edge of the hole. The vibration changed again, becoming somehow sadder, broken. Jake began to understand. The metal was telling him where it hurt. Over the next hour, the cubs taught Jake to feel what they felt. They showed him how to place his hands on different parts of the shuttle and sense the vibrations that ran through the structure. Healthy metal hummed steadily. Damaged metal vibrated differently, creating discord in the overall harmony of the ship. The largest cub picked up Jake's plasma torch, but instead of using it to cut, it adjusted the settings to the lowest possible heat. It began working on the edges of the hole, not cutting, but smoothing. Each tiny adjustment changed the vibration pattern slightly, bringing it closer to harmony with the rest of the engine. Jake tried to copy what the cub was doing. His first attempts were clumsy, too rough. The cubs made corrective sounds and showed him how to move more gently. It was like learning to play a musical instrument where the music was felt instead of heard. The middle-sized cub took over the patch installation. Instead of forcing the metal into place, it positioned the patch and began working around the edges with its claws. But these were not random movements. The cub was following the vibration patterns Jake was beginning to sense, welding only where the metal wanted to join. As the sun climbed higher, Jake found himself working alongside the three cubs as if they had been a team for years. They communicated through gestures, sounds, and the shared sense of the shuttle's mechanical harmony. When Jake made a mistake, the cubs gently corrected him. When he did something right, they chirped approval. By midday, the engine patch was complete, but it was unlike anything Jake had ever seen. Instead of a simple flat piece of metal covering a hole, the cubs had created something that flowed with the curves of the engine housing. The joins were so smooth they were almost invisible. When Jake placed his hand on the patch, it hummed in perfect harmony with the rest of the engine. The smallest cub approached Jake and gently took his injured hand again. The cut had stopped bleeding hours ago, but the cub seemed concerned about it. Using the same delicate touch it had used on the engine, the cub traced the edges of the wound with one claw. To Jake's amazement, the cut began to close. Not through any alien magic, but because the cub was showing him how to align the edges of the skin properly, how to reduce the tension that was keeping the wound open. Within minutes, the cut had sealed itself into a thin line that barely hurt. The cubs stepped back and chittered among themselves, clearly pleased with their work. Jake stared at the repaired engine, hardly believing what he had just experienced. These young creatures had not just taught him to fix his shuttle, they had taught him to understand it. As he started the engine and heard it purr to life with perfect efficiency, Jake realized that the cubs had given him something far more valuable than a simple repair. They had shown him an entirely new way of thinking about technology, about working with machines instead of simply commanding them. The engine hummed contentedly, and for the first time since his crash, Jake allowed himself to believe that he might actually make it home. The next morning brought new challenges and revelations. Jake's shuttle engine was running, but other systems needed attention. The navigation computer flickered in and out of function. The hull had several small cracks that could become serious problems during atmospheric flight. Most importantly, the life support recycling system was making worrying sounds that suggested it might fail soon. The three cubs seemed to sense Jake's concern. They gathered around him as he opened diagnostic panels, their golden eyes studying each new problem with intense focus. Jake had begun to think of them by the sounds they made when greeting him. The largest made a sound like Zix, the middle one sounded like Kara, and the smallest responded to something that sounded like Noth. Zix approached the navigation computer and placed both hands flat against its housing. The computer was mounted inside the shuttle's main console, but somehow Zix seemed to be feeling its internal workings through the metal casing. The cub's eyes closed in concentration, and it began making soft clicking sounds. Kara and Noth joined their older companion, each placing hands on different parts of the shuttle's control systems. They were not just feeling for vibrations anymore, Jake realized. They were having a conversation with the shuttle itself, learning about its condition in ways that his diagnostic equipment could never match. "What are you hearing?" Jake asked softly. Zix opened its eyes and looked at Jake thoughtfully. The cub made a series of gestures, pointing first at the navigation computer, then at its own head, then at Jake. The message was clear, the computer was confused, its thoughts scattered. Noth, the smallest cub, took Jake's hand and guided it to a specific spot on the console. Jake felt the familiar vibrations he was learning to recognize, but this time there was something different. The steady hum was interrupted by irregular stutters, like a heartbeat with missed beats. Kara moved to a different panel and began tracing patterns in the air above the controls. At first, Jake thought the cub was just gesturing randomly. Then he realized that Kara was mapping something invisible. Energy flows, electrical patterns that moved through the shuttle's systems like blood through veins. The cubs began working together in a way that seemed almost telepathic. Zix would touch one part of the shuttle and make a sound. Kara would respond by adjusting something on the opposite side of the cockpit. Noth would add its own touch to a third location, and suddenly the navigation computer would flicker to life for a few seconds before fading again. They were not just fixing individual components, Jake realized. They were treating the shuttle as a single living organism, understanding how each part affected every other part. When the navigation computer failed, it was not just because of a broken circuit board. It was because the computer's failure was part of a larger pattern of stress and damage that ran throughout the entire ship. Jake watched in fascination as the Cubs demonstrated their understanding. Zix showed him how to trace electrical pathways by following almost invisible magnetic fields with his fingertips. The sensation was subtle, like the difference between touching silk and cotton. But once Jake learned to feel it, he could map the shuttle's electrical system without looking at a single wire. Kara taught him about structural harmony. She placed Jake's hands on two different parts of the hull and had him feel how stress in one area created answering tensions throughout the shuttle's frame. By adjusting the stress in one small section, Kara could relieve pressure points that were affecting systems many feet away. Nuth focused on teaching Jake about energy efficiency. The smallest cub showed him how to feel the difference between components that were working smoothly and those that were fighting against their own design. A relay that was mounted at the wrong angle created resistance that rippled through the entire electrical grid. A coolant line that was bent too sharply caused turbulence that reduced efficiency throughout the cooling system. As the day progressed, Jake began to understand the deeper principles behind what the Cubs were teaching him. They were not using magic or alien technology. They were using senses that humans possessed but had forgotten how to use: the ability to feel tiny vibrations, to sense magnetic fields, to detect the heat signatures that revealed how energy flowed through complex systems. The Cubs showed Jake how to calibrate his hands like precision instruments. By adjusting pressure and position, he could feel stress fractures that would not show up on scanners for weeks. By learning to sense electromagnetic patterns, he could diagnose electrical problems without opening a single panel. More importantly, they taught him to think differently about repairs. Instead of replacing broken parts, Jake learned to understand why they had broken in the first place. A failed circuit was often the result of stress from an unbalanced load somewhere else in the system. A cracked hull plate usually meant that forces were not being distributed properly through the shuttle's frame. Working with the Cubs, Jake began to see his shuttle as they saw it, not as a collection of separate components, but as a single integrated organism with its own needs and natural rhythms. When he approached repairs with this understanding, the work became almost effortless. Parts wanted to fit together in certain ways. Systems had preferred operating patterns that made them more efficient and longer-lasting. The navigation computer was the perfect example. Jake had been trying to repair it by replacing damaged memory cores and processor units. The Cubs showed him that the computer's problems were not in its hardware, but in how it was connected to the rest of the shuttle. The mounting brackets created vibrations that interfered with the computer's delicate circuits. The power supply carried electrical noise from other systems that confused the computer's logic functions. By adjusting the mounting system to dampen vibrations and installing filters to clean the power supply, Jake and the Cubs restored the navigation computer to full function without replacing a single internal component. More than that, the computer now operated more efficiently than it had when the shuttle was new. The hull repairs followed the same pattern. Instead of simply patching the cracks with metal plates, the Cubs taught Jake to redistribute the stress patterns that had caused the cracks in the first place. By making small adjustments to the shuttle's internal framework, they eliminated the forces that were trying to tear the hull apart. The cracks sealed themselves as the metal relaxed into its natural, unstressed state. The life support system proved to be the most complex challenge. The worrying sounds were coming from the air recycling pumps, which were working harder than they should to maintain proper atmosphere. The Cubs' examination revealed that the problem was not in the pumps themselves, but in the distribution network that carried air throughout the shuttle. Nuth guided Jake through the process of rebalancing the airflow. By adjusting valve settings and repositioning intake filters, they eliminated bottlenecks and turbulence, that had been forcing the pumps to work against resistance. The system quieted immediately and began operating with smooth efficiency. As the sun set on Jake's second day with the Cubs, his shuttle was not just repaired, but improved. Every system hummed with perfect harmony. The engine produced 30% more power while using less fuel. The hull was stronger than its original design. The life support system could maintain atmosphere for twice as long as before. Jake sat in the pilot's seat and ran through his pre-flight checklist. Every system showed green. Every component reported optimal function. He could leave this planet whenever he chose. But as he looked at the three Cubs who had transformed his understanding of technology, Jake realized that he had gained something far more valuable than a working shuttle. He had learned to see the universe through different eyes, to understand that the relationship between intelligence and technology was not about domination and control, but about harmony and cooperation. The Cubs had taught him that the best repairs were those that worked with the natural inclinations of matter and energy rather than against them. Tomorrow, Jake would return to human space. But he would carry with him a new way of thinking that would change everything he thought he knew about engineering and technology. The Cubs had given him a gift that would transform not just his own work, but potentially the work of every human engineer who was willing to learn their methods. As night fell over the alien jungle, Jake made a decision that would change the course of his life and the future of human technology. He would not be leaving the Cubs behind. The morning of Jake's planned departure brought unexpected visitors. As he ran final systems checks on his shuttle, the jungle around him began to rustle with movement. The three Cubs, who had been helping him load supplies, suddenly became very still. Their ears pointed toward the forest, and they made low warning sounds. Jake reached for his weapon, but Zix placed a gentle hand on his arm and shook its head. This was not danger. This was family. The adult Vraxani emerged from the jungle like living shadows. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he saw them for the first time. The reports had not been wrong about their size or presence. Each adult stood over 11 feet tall with powerful limbs and intelligent eyes that seemed to see everything at once. Their fur was darker than their cubs, marked with intricate patterns that spoke of age and experience. There were 6 adults in total, moving with the fluid grace of born predators. They approached Jake's shuttle in formation, clearly working together as a unit. Jake stood perfectly still, acutely aware that these creatures could tear him apart without effort if they chose to. The largest of the adults, clearly the pack leader, stepped forward and examined Jake with piercing golden eyes. The Cubs moved to stand between Jake and their elders, chittering rapidly in their musical language. Jake caught familiar sounds in their communication. The Cubs were telling their story, explaining what had happened over the past 3 days. The pack leader listened intently, occasionally asking what sounded like questions. The Cubs would respond enthusiastically, pointing at the shuttle, at Jake, at the various repairs they had made together. Slowly, Jake began to understand that he was being evaluated not as a threat, but as a potential pack member. The conversation continued for nearly an hour. Jake stood quietly, letting the Cubs speak for him. Whatever they were saying seemed to be working in his favor. The adult's posture gradually relaxed from alert wariness to curious interest. Finally, the pack leader approached Jake directly. It studied him for a long moment, then placed one massive hand on Jake's shoulder. The touch was firm but gentle, and Jake felt no fear. The adult made a deep rumbling sound that seemed to come from its chest, then stepped back and made a gesture that Jake somehow understood meant acceptance. The Cubs chirped excitedly and danced around Jake's legs. Noth tugged at his sleeve and pointed toward the shuttle, clearly eager to show their elders what they had accomplished. The adults followed with dignified curiosity as Jake gave them a tour of the repairs. What happened next amazed Jake even more than the Cubs' original techniques. The adults could see things that even their young could not. They pointed out stress patterns that would not become problems for months or years. They suggested improvements that would make the shuttle's systems even more efficient. Most remarkably, they approved of what the Cubs had done, making sounds of pride and encouragement. When it came time to leave, Jake faced an impossible choice. He had grown attached to the 3 Cubs who had saved his life and changed his understanding of technology. The idea of leaving them behind felt like abandoning family, but he could not ask them to leave their own families and their home planet. The pack leader seemed to understand Jake's dilemma. It made a series of gestures and sounds, clearly communicating something important. The Cubs listened intently, then turned to Jake with expressions of excitement and determination. Zix approached Jake and placed both hands on his chest, directly over his heart. The Cub made a sound that Jake had learned meant family. Kara and Noth joined their older companion, adding their own voices to the declaration. They were choosing to come with him. The adults showed no sign of distress at this decision. Instead, they seemed pleased that their young had found a worthy companion. The pack leader made what Jake interpreted as formal farewells to each Cub, touching foreheads and making deep rumbling sounds. This was not goodbye forever, Jake realized. This was a blessing for a journey. The launch from Kepler 442b went perfectly. Jake's shuttle, enhanced by Vraxani techniques, lifted off with smooth power and climbed through the atmosphere without strain. The 3 Cubs strapped themselves into passenger seats with obvious excitement, chattering as they watched their world shrink below them. The journey to the Coalition space station took 18 hours. During that time, Jake learned more about his passengers than he had discovered in 3 days on the planet. The Cubs were not just mechanically gifted, they were natural teachers who seemed to delight in sharing knowledge. They spent the trip showing Jake additional techniques for reading ship systems, ways to optimize performance that human engineers had never considered. When Jake's shuttle docked at Research Station Alpha, he faced immediate skepticism from his superiors. Commander Lisa Hayes and Chief Engineer Ryan Cooper listened to his report with expressions of polite disbelief. 3 alien Cubs who could teach engineering? Techniques that improved machinery by working with it, instead of just fixing it? It sounded like the fantasy of a pilot who had spent too much time alone. That skepticism lasted exactly 47 minutes. Ryan Cooper had brought Jake to Engineering Bay 3 to demonstrate what he claimed to have learned. The bay housed a damaged fighter that had been written off as unrepairable. The pilot had pushed the engines beyond safe limits during a combat engagement, causing cascading failures throughout multiple systems. 3 different engineering teams had declared the fighter a total loss. Jake approached the damaged fighter with Zix, Kara, and Noth at his side. The Cubs immediately began their examination, placing hands on the fighter's hull and closing their eyes in concentration. They chirped softly among themselves, sharing information about what they were sensing. "The engine housing is cracked," Ryan said, crossing his arms. "The power distribution grid is fried. The navigation computer is a melted mess. We'd have to replace 70% of the ship's components." Jake nodded and placed his own hands on the fighter's hull. Thanks to the Cubs' teaching, he could feel what they felt. The damage was extensive, but it followed patterns. The engine failure had created stress waves that propagated through the ship's structure, breaking components that should have been safe. The electrical failures had cascaded when overloaded systems tried to compensate for damaged ones. "We're not going to replace anything," Jake said quietly. "We're going to fix the pattern." What followed was the most remarkable engineering demonstration anyone at the station had ever seen. Jake and the Cubs worked together like a symphony orchestra, each contributing their unique skills to restore harmony to the damaged fighter. They did not replace parts, they repositioned them. They did not rebuild systems, they retuned them. The Cubs showed the watching engineers how to feel stress fractures before they became visible, how to sense electrical resistance that created system inefficiencies, how to listen to the subtle sounds that machinery made when it was happy versus when it was struggling. Most importantly, they demonstrated the fundamental principle behind all their techniques, working with technology instead of simply commanding it. The damaged fighter came back to life gradually, system by system, not just functional, but operating better than it ever had. The engine produced more power with lower emissions. The electrical systems carried current more efficiently. Even the navigation computer, rebuilt using Vraksani principles, processed data faster and more accurately than the original design. Ryan Cooper stared at the fully functional fighter in stunned silence. "This should have taken 3 weeks," he said finally. "You did it in 2 hours." Commander Hayes was already making calls to fleet headquarters. Within hours, Jake found himself giving demonstrations to senior engineering staff from across the coalition. The Cubs, initially shy around so many new humans, quickly warmed up when they realized these people genuinely wanted to learn. What amazed everyone was how naturally the Cubs took to teaching. They seemed to understand that humans learned differently than Vraksani, and they adapted their methods accordingly. Where they might show another Vraksani something once and expect understanding, they patiently repeated demonstrations for humans until the concepts became clear. Within a week, Engineering Bay 3 had been converted into an informal classroom. Engineers came from across the station to learn what the Cubs had to teach. The techniques they demonstrated could be applied to everything from shuttle engines to life support systems to weapons arrays. Jake watched it all with a mixture of pride and amazement. The 3 young aliens who had saved his life were now saving his entire species from centuries of inefficient engineering practices. They were teaching humanity to see technology not as something to be conquered, but as something to be partnered with. The Cubs seemed to understand the significance of what they were doing. They approached each new lesson with serious dedication, clearly taking their role as teachers seriously. But they also maintained their playful nature, celebrating each human success with excited chirps and the Vraksani equivalent of applause. As reports of the new techniques spread through Coalition space, Jake realized that he and the Cubs had started something that would change the future of human technology. This was just the beginning. 6 months after Jake's return from Kepler 442b, the Coalition Engineering Academy buzzed with activity unlike anything in its history. What had started as emergency repairs on a crashed shuttle had evolved into a complete revolution in how humans approach technology. Captain Jake Morrison, recently promoted and now head of the newly created Harmonic Engineering Division, stood in the main lecture hall watching the morning's training session. 300 engineers from across Coalition space sat in perfect silence as Zix demonstrated how to diagnose engine problems through touch alone. The large Vraksani cub, now slightly bigger after months of good nutrition, placed its hands on a deliberately damaged engine housing and closed its eyes. "The fracture extends 7 inches deeper than visible scans indicate," Zix said through the translation device that had been developed to convert Vraksani speech into human language. "The stress pattern suggests the failure originated from improper mounting alignment, not material fatigue." A human engineer stepped forward and activated a deep scan probe. The readings confirmed exactly what Zix had detected through touch alone. Murmurs of amazement rippled through the audience. Even after months of demonstrations, the accuracy of Vraksani senses continued to astound human observers. Kara took over the next part of the lesson, showing how to repair the damage using harmonic engineering principles. Instead of cutting out the fractured section and welding in a replacement, Kara redistributed the stress patterns that had caused the fracture. Working with tools that looked more like musical instruments than engineering equipment, the middle-sized cub adjusted the engine's mounting system to eliminate the forces that had broken the housing. The fracture sealed itself as the metal relaxed into its natural stress-free state. The engine not only worked again, but operated more efficiently than before the damage occurred. Nath, the smallest of the 3 cubs and now recognized as the most gifted teacher among them, concluded the demonstration by explaining the theory behind what they had just accomplished. "Metal remembers," Noth said in its careful translated speech. "When you force it into unnatural shapes, it always tries to return to harmony. We do not fight this tendency. We use it." Jake smiled as he watched the human engineers scribbling notes and asking detailed questions. The Cubs had become celebrities throughout Coalition space, but they wore their fame lightly. What mattered to them was sharing knowledge and seeing their students succeed. The transformation in human engineering capabilities had been dramatic and swift. Ships that should have taken weeks to repair were back in service within days. New designs incorporated harmonic engineering principles from the beginning, resulting in vessels that were more efficient, more reliable, and required far less maintenance than previous generations. More importantly, the philosophical shift was changing how humans thought about technology in general. The old approach of dominating and controlling machinery was giving way to a new understanding of partnership and cooperation. Engineers who learned Vraksani techniques reported higher job satisfaction and better relationships with the equipment they maintained. The military applications had been particularly significant. Combat engineers trained in harmonic engineering could perform battlefield repairs that were previously impossible. During the recent border skirmish with the hegemony forces, Coalition ships had maintained operational status despite damage that should have knocked them out of the fight completely. Jake's communicator chimed with an urgent message from Fleet Command. Admiral Patricia Stone wanted an immediate briefing on the latest training results. Jake made his way through the Academy's corridors, noting the changes that 6 months had brought to the facility. Where once the hallways had echoed with the harsh sounds of cutting torches and impact hammers, they now hummed with the gentler tones of harmonic engineering tools. Students could be seen in practice rooms, hands pressed against machinery as they learned to feel the subtle vibrations that revealed mechanical health. The entire atmosphere of the Academy had become calmer and more focused. Admiral Stone's office overlooked the Academy's main workshop, where advanced students worked on real Coalition vessels under Vraksani supervision. Through the large windows, Jake could see human engineers and Vraksani Cubs collaborating on projects that would have been impossible for either species alone. "The results are beyond anything we projected," Admiral Stone said without preamble as Jake entered her office. "Maintenance costs are down 40% across the fleet. Equipment failures have dropped to nearly zero. Most remarkably, ships incorporating harmonic engineering principles are outperforming their design specifications by margins that should be impossible." Jake nodded, unsurprised by the report. He had seen similar results in his own division's work. "The Cubs predicted this," he said. "They told me that human technology was working against itself because we did not understand how to let machines operate naturally. And now we do understand," the Admiral continued. "The question is what we do with this knowledge. There are requests from every branch of government and industry to share harmonic engineering techniques. Everyone wants to learn what the Vraksani Cubs have taught us." This had been a growing concern for Jake. The Cubs were willing teachers, but they were still young aliens far from their home and families. The demands on their time were increasing exponentially as word of their abilities spread throughout human space. "We need to train more human instructors," Jake said. "The Cubs have taught the principles to hundreds of our engineers. Some of them are ready to become teachers themselves." Admiral Stone smiled. "Already in progress. We are establishing harmonic engineering training centers on 12 worlds. Your 3 friends will supervise the initial setup, but human instructors will take over day-to-day teaching responsibilities." Jake felt relief at this news. Zix, Kara, and Noth had expressed homesickness recently, missing their families and the forests of Kepler 442b. They had fulfilled their mission of sharing knowledge with humanity. Now they deserved the choice of whether to continue teaching or return home. The conversation was interrupted by excited voices from the workshop below. Jake and Admiral Stone looked out the window to see a crowd of engineers gathered around a test station where Noth was demonstrating something new. Even from a distance, they could see the amazement on the humans' faces. "What are they working on today?" Admiral Stone asked. Jake checked his schedule tablet. Noth was going to show the advanced class how to optimize fusion reactors using harmonic resonance principles. Apparently, the technique can increase power output while reducing fuel consumption and radioactive waste. Admiral Stone stared at him. "How much increase in output?" "Preliminary tests suggest 20 to 30% improvement over current reactor designs," Jake replied, "with zero increase in radiation hazards and a significant reduction in waste products." The Admiral leaned back in her chair, looking somewhat overwhelmed. "Jake, do you realize what this means? Clean, efficient fusion power could transform every aspect of human civilization. Energy poverty could become a thing of the past." Jake understood the implications, but he also understood something else that was equally important. "Admiral, the Cubs are not just teaching us techniques. They are teaching us a new way of thinking about our relationship with technology. The specific improvements are impressive, but the philosophical shift may be even more valuable." Over the following weeks, Jake watched as the first human instructors began teaching harmonic engineering independently. Lisa Hayes, the station commander who had initially been skeptical of Jake's reports, had become one of the most effective teachers. Her background in psychology helped her understand how to translate Vraksani sensory techniques into methods that humans could learn and use. Ryan Cooper had specialized in mechanical applications, developing a curriculum that taught human engineers to sense stress patterns and energy flows in complex machinery. His students were achieving results that amazed even the Cubs who had taught the original techniques. Most encouraging was the emergence of hybrid techniques that combined human technological knowledge with Vraksani sensory abilities. Human engineers were developing new tools and methods that enhanced their natural senses, allowing them to achieve sensitivity levels that approached those of their Vraksani teachers. As the training program expanded, Jake made a decision that had been weighing on his mind for weeks. He called Zix, Kara, and Noth to his office for a private conversation. "You have given humanity an incredible gift," Jake told the three Cubs. "We will never forget what you have taught us. But I know you miss your families and your home. If you want to return to Kepler 442b, I will personally escort you there." The Cubs exchanged glances and chirped softly among themselves. Finally, Zix spoke for all three of them. "We are proud of what humans have learned. You have become excellent students and teachers. But our work here is not finished." Kara stepped forward. "There are more techniques to share, more ways that our species can learn from each other. We choose to stay and continue teaching." Noth added, "Besides, Jake Morrison, you are our family too now. Pack bonds are not easily broken." Jake felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the office temperature. The three young aliens who had saved his life had become far more than teachers or colleagues. They were indeed family. As he watched them return to their students, Jake reflected on how much had changed since his shuttle had crashed in an alien jungle. What had started as a desperate struggle for survival had become a partnership that was transforming human civilization. The techniques pioneered by three curious Cubs were spreading throughout Coalition space and beyond. Engineers trained in harmonic engineering were taking their knowledge to every corner of human territory, bringing improvements in efficiency, reliability, and sustainability to countless worlds. More importantly, they were carrying with them a new understanding of what it meant to work with technology instead of simply commanding it. This philosophical shift was creating a gentler, more sustainable approach to technological development that would benefit generations to come. Jake smiled as he heard the familiar sounds of learning drifting up from the workshops below. Somewhere in those rooms, the next generation of engineers was discovering that the best way to fix something was not to force it back to its original state, but to help it find a new harmony that was even better than before. The three cubs who had helped a stranded human fix his shuttle had done far more than they could have imagined. They had taught an entire species to listen to the songs that matter sings and to dance in harmony with the technology that shapes their lives.